Hello, and welcome to Pehchan, where we unpack the stories and identities of extraordinary Pakistani Americans. Today, I've got a genuinely cool guy on the podcast. Kashif is somebody I want to be when I grow up, and that's funny because he is probably much younger than me. But Kashif is doing some incredible work. He is the co-founder and president of the Pillars Fund, which actually helps American Muslim civic institutions and leaders build a more just society. And if you're following the news these days, we need that desperately. On a side note, Kashif also hangs out with really cool people like Riz Ahmed and other Muslim celebrities who some of us hosting this podcast might have a crush on. Not giving you away at all, Amreen here. But Kashif, we know you hang out with people cooler than us, but we're really happy that you're chilling with us today.
That's very kind and generous, and my life is a lot less cooler than I think people think it is. But thank you; it's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll find out about that. I want to begin, Kashif, today with a story about your parents and what it was like growing up in their shadow. Your dad was an artsy dude. Your mom was a Sidi Sadi Larki from Karachi. They had an arranged marriage in Jackson Heights. That sounds like the beginning of a Netflix special or a Hum TV drama, and you can only you can tell us which way it turned out. But talk to us a little bit about what it was like growing up in I believe it was in Astoria where you grew up. But talk to us, and then a little bit of Cincinnati. But talk to us about what childhood was like for you.
Well, I mean, it was certainly traumatic. So there's that part. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so my dad is from Rawalpindi, and he moved to America in I believe 1977, and he came to America to go to art school, to go to Pratt. He had graduated a few years earlier from National College of Arts in Lahore, and was working as a set designer. Was always a pretty creative and artsy guy, always a bit of the black sheep in the family. They come sort of from a family of academics, and he actually had to run away to go to NCA. My grandfather, who I never met, who passed away around the time I was born, was not the biggest fan of him going to NCA, so he had to actually literally run away to go to NCA, and then lived in London for a few years, and moved to America in 1977 to go to Pratt in Brooklyn. And then, my mom was very young when she came to America. My mom was 16. She came with her entire family. She had 7 siblings, and my grandparents and her cousins, a bunch of people, all sort of settled in New York in around 1976. And so, and then they had met through, I think the story is that, maybe my dad's oldest brother's wife kind of knew my grandparents, and sort of just, they did I think they had one date at White Castle. That was literally they had one date at White Castle that I think was in Queens and I believe Jackson Heights. And
Amreen would take one date with Riz Ahmed at White Castle. No, I'm joking.
And then they got married. I believe, if I believe this is correct. I don't know if it's still there or if it's still named this, but there's a restaurant in Jackson Heights called Shaheen, and there's a basement. I think they used to do weddings, and so I think that's where they got married. And so yeah, that was all in New York, and so they sort of kind of met and got married. And that's where I was born. I was born in Queens. I lived there till I was about 7 years old. I was born in 1983 and lived there till I was about 7 years old. And then really kind of grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. That's really sort of where I called home for most of my for most of my childhood. And so, yeah, I mean, in terms of what my childhood was like, I mean, it was, I thought it was a relatively sort of average, normal childhood. I think it was until I got older that I realized that just small things, I think my dad's sort of love of music. I remember one of my favorite memories as a kid was Sunday mornings. He used to wake up and always come down. There was always music playing. He had a massive music library both Urdu, Pakistani, but also like American, like hearing stories about him going to see Pink Floyd when he was like, in his 20s. And he really kind of, it was really, I think my love of music and sort of that obsession really came from him. And yeah, my mom, it's really funny because this is the best way I feel like you might be able to appreciate this. This is how I've always described my parents' relationship, just to give you a sense of how different they were and how ridiculous of a childhood that I think that I had. Is that if you were to ask my dad, like, what is art? He would sort of go on this like 10-minute sort of art is life, art is beauty, art is sort of like how we see the world. And he would sort of, and then if you ask my mom, like, what is art? She'd be like, it's Nange Log and it's haram. Like, that's like legit, like how my mom sort of, because she just, there was a real love there, I think. I mean, there was a lot of tension there as well, but there was a love there. But yeah, it was a really interesting sort of, and again, like when you grow up, it's your life is just what your life is. You think it's pretty normal and whatever. But it wasn't until I got older that I started to like kind of laugh and could laugh at some of the ridiculousness of their sort of the ways that they interacted with each other, and also just kind of their differing ways of how they saw the world. My dad was he was like, I think, a romantic, and he was like a very sort of heady dude, or he is a very heady dude. And my mom was just a more pragmatic, and women of that generation. I mean, they had kids, I have a lot of empathy because it's like they didn't have time for bullshit. They were just like trying to raise a family in a country that they didn't know, in a language that they weren't familiar with. And so I say all of this with sort of laughter, because I think it did kind of shape who I am today and sort of how I see the world.
I love the ways that you describe how different your parents are, because it makes me think like this is a feature that you can only get from arranged marriages. Like no artists, right? Like imagine like if they had a chance to really get to know each other, and art is like life to your dad. He's not going to date somebody who thinks art is ridiculous, right? I don't think in a love marriage you end up with these kinds of exciting matchups where people fundamentally see the world so differently. It's kind of hilarious to think your mom was so dismissive of what was like so central to your dad's identity.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because so my mom passed away it'll be 10 years in February, and I adored my mom. I was very close to her. In most ways I was closer to her than my dad. I think that my dad had a sort of larger influence on sort of like the person I've become, but in terms of just this closeness, it was always to my mom. But one thing that always kind of, I've always been really, really fascinated by their relationship. I think one thing about me that is I ask a lot. I mean, I know like so I have one sister, and the four of us, we had a very tight knit family, but very dysfunctional. Like a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming, a lot of sort of like, but there was like a ride or die mentality in this family in some very complicated and nuanced ways. But it is kind of funny. I always go back and like really sort of try to understand the relationship, because it's fascinating to me. Because I would ask my dad, like, why did you get married to mom? Or like, mom, like, why did you get married to like, it didn't actually make any sense. And I have all types of theories as to sort of why, it happened. And, and then they just sort of, but, life is weird as anybody knows, like, relationships, marriage, all that stuff is, it never, it's never exactly how you think it's going to be. So but I'm always fascinated by them.
Yeah. The other thing I wonder about your childhood, having grown up in a pretty strict Pakistani house myself, and knowing that a lot of Pakistani homes are pretty rigid. What is it like when one of your parents is a rebel, when they've run away from home, when they've done kind of, defying things against their elders? Like, did he then give you permission to do that? Or was he like, no, you need to be a good son and listen to what I say and obey me?
It's a really good question. I mean, I'll say that like, I grew up in an interesting home in that, like, I mean, my dad definitely, like, it's weird. Like, they were strict in some ways and not strict in other ways. Like, I mean, I think that, and you know, my mom was definitely a lot more traditional, but I think what made my mom incredibly special, and the thing that I think that I miss about her a lot, is that she had this incredible ability to sort of like have a very deep faith, have deep sort of attachment to her values, and sort of try to impart those in her kids. But she but you know, we were dumb kids. Like we were kind of always rebelling. And I was kind of more rebelling against my dad. My sister was rebelling more against my mom. But one thing that my mom, I think, did really well was that she wasn't strict in a way. Like, she had this incredible thing that, like, she'd be like, I love you. And like, I also hate you right now because you're making my life hell. But like, we always knew that, like, no matter how bad we messed up or no matter what we did, like, she was always just going to be support. Like, she wasn't someone that's like even like when she was like teaching me Quran when I was a kid, like, I hated it. I was miserable. I was like, just like, this is not fun at all. And she was like a terrible teacher. She was like yelling at me and like just but at the same time, like, I always felt like a real love. Like, even when we rebelled, I felt like a really, like, just, I never felt like I couldn't do something. Like, we had boundaries, obviously, but like, I don't know. I just didn't grow up. I didn't grow up like super, super scared of like, oh my God, if I do this. I just kind of grew up with like, I'm going to try to respect. There was a lot of things I didn't do out of respect to my mom because I just didn't want to hurt her. But it wasn't out of fear. My parents never really like sort of raised us out of like a real fear. We never had a real, I was never afraid of my parents. I mean, with my dad, maybe a little bit because, I mean, he had a little bit of a temper and stuff like that. And now as you get older, you realize like, there's a lot of stress. Again, it's like a generational thing. I mean, when I was a kid, I was just like, why is this guy always angry? Why is he always upset? But as you get older, you're like, dude, there's a lot of pressure on, like he, and then you have like these two little like rebellious, shitty little kids who are just like constantly like challenging your authority. Like, and then you're sort of a stranger in a strange land and you're trying to sort of provide and do all these things. So there's a lot of factors, but yeah, I think I don't think I saw it as anything super special until I got older and I started like hanging out with a lot of other Pakistani friends. And I was like, oh, wow, like they grew up in some ways different, in some ways similar. I don't think my upbringing was like so crazy unique. I think there's a lot of people that grew up like sort of the way that I did. But I do think a large majority or a big portion of Pakistanis sort of tend to have just a little bit more, there's just more rules and I don't think my dad ever said I don't think my dad was ever like, you should rebel. No, in fact, I mean, he never did. But I think that like sometimes these things are just, they're in you. Like at 40 years old, I look at myself and I'm like, oh my God, like I have this. I don't think my dad was like, you should be rebellious. I'm just like, I just have this rebellious spirit in me. Like I don't think I can sort of suppress it. It's just there. And so I'd like to think that my dad probably looks at me and sort of sees a little bit of himself in it. And maybe there's a part of him that's like, how mad can I get? This was what I was doing. And,
yeah.
But I also don't know how self-aware he is about that. Like, so, I mean, but yeah, like a lot of the rules that I think that were imposed were kind of self-imposed. Like, they were really coming from a place of not wanting to like, to just hurt my mom. Like they really like, but she was never like, I mean, obviously there's things that you couldn't do. And she sort of, told us, where our boundaries were and we pushed them. But yeah, like with my dad, like, I mean, he was like I love him, but he was like a non-factor. Like, I mean, in his childhood, that dude was like, he wasn't even really around that much. He was just working all the time. And he traveled a lot for work. And so it wasn't until I got older that I really developed a bond with him. Like in my childhood, it was very much like me and my mom and my sister.
I mean, in that sense, it's pretty traditional because your dad had a corporate job, right? And so he was the breadwinner, and then your mom was the one who was raising you guys, right? It's pretty typical.
Totally, yeah, yeah. And so in those ways, there was definitely some sort of yeah.
The other thing that I found fascinating, and Ambreen and I have talked about this a lot as well, is you saying you followed the rules even though there were few because of respect and not out of fear. And that's such a Pakistani thing, where it's out of respect for your mom. But what's interesting is even after you become an adult, you don't do things that you want to do because you don't do it in front of them. And so you end up living this kind of double life. And Amreen and I sort of have chatted a lot about that. But it's interesting that there's a part of that coming from you as well, where you talk about sort of respect. But I want to sort of move this forward a little bit and talk about music and art and how sort of that inspired you into activism. I know that as a kid, sort of listening to punk rock and sort of music had an influence sort of on your life and how you sort of eventually picked activism's path. Can you talk a little bit about that as well in your childhood, about the role that music was playing in the background as all of this was happening?
Yeah, it played such an important role. I mean, I contend that I grew up in like the best era like ever. Like the 90s were just like the best. And there was like something really cool happening. So particularly in the music scene. And so, when I was a kid, so again, I was born in 83. So when I was probably around like 10 years old or so, 11, I think, Nirvana, like Kurt Cobain died in 94, I believe. And then sort of, every kid was like super into Nirvana. But to me, the thing that really kind of set me on this path was a band. It was Green Day. It was the band Green Day. They put out this record called Dookie in, I think it was 94. And fully obsessed with that record, like to completely just, it changed my life. That record changed my life. It sort of introduced me to what I've sort of now come to realize was sort of that like 80s and 90s, like hardcore punk sort of scene that like a lot of like really, really cool and interesting bands came out, particularly at that time around the Bay Area, which is where the Green Day was from. And what I think was really important about it, there was this really, and it's not just the music. So there was this, the thing that's so fascinating about that time is that there was like this big debate on the underground about whether like punk rock was like this like independent sort of like independent type of like Raging Against the Machine type of music that was like speaking out against the man and all of these things. And these major labels were sort of capitalizing on the success of Nirvana, and so they were courting a lot of these big bands. And one of the bands that they courted was Green Day, and they put out that album and it blew up. It was huge. At that same time, there's a band called The Offspring that put out a record that like really got big. And it was a really interesting debate. So it wasn't just the music that I think was really inspirational to me. It was this whole debate of like, do you fight within the system? Do you fight outside of the system? Like, because that was really sort of what that debate was. And the Green Days of the world were like, well, we're going to sign on to the biggest label that we can because we want the world to hear our music. And when you're in the college kids at the time were just like, I can curse on this? I tend to curse a little bit, but I don't.
Go ahead.
I won't do too much. Okay. But what I think is really interesting is that it was the whole scene was about sort of like, do you fight the system and how do you fight the system? And so for me, that became something I became really entrenched in. And, as I get older, I actually recognize the value of what Green Day was saying is because of Green Day, a little 10-year-old kid from Cincinnati, Ohio, was exposed to this underground scene of incredible bands that were sort of in that same vein, and they were a lot smaller. But Green Day, when they got really huge, like I remember there was a band called The Queers, and like they were this like punk rock band from the Bay, and like they're a tiny little band. And like when Green Day played Madison Square Garden, they had The Queers open for them. Like it's insane. Like as a kid, you don't understand that, but when you get older, you're like, wow, that's wild. But it also had a really big impact on me, and so I got introduced to that music, and a lot of that music was very political in nature. There was, in particular, there was a band called Propagandhi out of Winnipeg that me and my friend Brendan, who, I'm still really close with to this day, we sort of got this record, and they were sort of talking about capitalism and homophobia and all of these things. And, as a 13, 14-year-old, like I didn't quite understand what capitalism was or even sort of things like homophobia and all of these things, but they had this like indelible impact on me. in that I knew there was a passion behind the ways in which these bands were talking about these topics. And I think one thing that I've sort of recognized about myself is I'm really drawn to like passion and intensity. I'm an intense person. And so for me, what I'm realizing, it wasn't the sort of like the message, because I didn't quite understand the message at the time, but it was this strive. Like they were talking about like anti-racism. And most of it was like, a lot of the bands I was listening to, there's a rich history of people of color in the punk rock movement, but like the stuff I was listening to was largely white. But they were talking about like, really interesting concepts like patriarchy and racism and all of these things. And so it just had this and it inspired me to pick up a guitar and sort of, play with my friends and do all these things that I don't think that I think that's sort of like the beauty of that music, is that it's, it's very accessible. It's like incredibly accessible. Like, when you go and you sort of see these like arena rock bands, it's cool. Like, I mean, ironically, like Green Day is now like a pretty big arena rock band, but there was something really fun about sort of seeing these like kind of kids that now you realize they're kids. They felt like adults at the time, but they were kids sort of playing in these like grungy little independent venues, and sort of it's just like 3 or 4 of them like with their instruments and talking about, really like serious topics. So it had a really big impact on me, and I mean, to this day, I'm there's a direct through line to sort of the work that I do today, the progressive activism and the spaces that I'm in today. I literally don't think any of that happens without that Green Day record in 1994.
That's so interesting. I have a Green Day story I want to share, which is that in 2005, I was living in Karachi, and I went to this like underground rock concert. It was probably like high school age, like kids and rock bands. And they played American Idiot by Green Day. And then when they finished, they were like, "Fuck America." And everybody, the crowd started saying it, and they were all shouting it out. And I remember I was there with other Americans just kind of looking over at them and be like, this makes no sense. Like, you can't like Green Day and then be sitting around using their music to like, flip off America. Like, it was so ironic to me in a way, because I was like, do you like American culture or do you not like it? Like, make up your mind.
Look, no, literally, like the song that had probably the biggest impact on me, and this is going to sound ridiculous, there is a song by Propaganda on their first record that's called "Stick the Flag Up Your Ass, You Goddamn Son of a Bitch." Like, that's what the song is called, and it's about flag burning. So punk rock was like this it's like the shocking thing. It's like it's meant to sort of like. And so, when you get older, you can contextualize this and being like, this is really funny. And, but I, even when you listen to some of that stuff, I was like, oh, I understand the sentiment. Like the sentiment is, like really sort of like speaking out against sort of these like hierarchical systems of war and destruction, et cetera. And so, but yeah, it's really funny. I mean, I was that sort of 15-year-old kid, like, listening to these like, anthems and slogans by these little like, white punk rockers.
That's fascinating. And I was going to say, it feels like, music and punk rock in particular was like your spirituality and your religion sort of growing up. And then the other sort of punctuation mark, I think you were 18 when 9/11 happened. And I think that's the other piece of the puzzle when it comes to sort of explaining the activism and the work that you've done. Talk to us a little bit about how 9/11 changed your life and sort of the trajectory of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I am of that generation that I think was impacted sort of almost like most directly, because 18 is a weird time in your life anyways. You're kind of going through all these changes and you're sort of being self-reflective. You're sort of like, who the hell am I? And, for me, I all things considered, I grew up in a pretty you grew up in like a little middle-class suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, mostly white. I didn't really sort of, I had like, my life was very dichotomous, and that like, I had like sort of Muslim friends, but they were like my Muslim friends from community. But then most of my like really close friends were like the white kids from high school. And I think that now that I look back, obviously I experienced sort of microaggressions and racism, but like, as a kid, like I never felt that I can't point to one singular moment or anything that really made me feel uncomfortable. I generally kind of found my tribe of people at a pretty young age, and they were pretty, progressive on a lot of on a lot of things. And I think that's what the music sort of bonded us. And many of them I'm still close to this day. So I didn't really like grow up in, I'm an introspective person by nature, but I definitely sort of didn't grow up sort of questioning. I knew I looked different and I knew I was different, but I don't know if I really sort of thought that much about it. And what was really interesting about 9/11, and again, this is a bit of a cliche story at this point, but it's because it's the experience of so many people. But I mean, for me, and I mean, I can speak to sort of how there was a direct change, like on September 12th, there was a direct change in my life in that I was still in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was supposed to start college. Maybe a week later, I was supposed to start college in like, I think mid-September of 2001. And I remember sort of feeling weird. Like, I mean, I think I've told the story a few times where me, my sister, and my dad went to this, like, there's the famous pizza place in Cincinnati called La Rosa's, and there was one in our neighborhood. We went there, and I remember just sort of distinctly sort of sitting down and feeling like everyone was looking at us, and that was like a new feeling. And maybe it wasn't a new feeling. Maybe it was happening before. I just didn't notice, but I certainly noticed, then. And so a lot of that was, I remember, like I remember like doing small things like, growing out my beard and being like, being that rebellious kid and being like, okay, I'm going to like, like I'm going to be like Muslim as hell because like, what the hell is this? Because I wasn't a religious kid. It wasn't like something that I was like really sort of adhering that, that strictly to. And so, so there was a lot of that. And then you start college and you're already kind of surrounded by, like it's like a story as old as time. Sort of the activism on college campuses is like long been documented and talked about. And sort of you add to that sort of like brown kids who were sort of seeing the world actively talk against our communities in ways that were really, really sort of difficult to sort of watch and hear, and not your own experiences, that it was very hard not to sort of fall into activism at that age. And then the Iraq War happened and we were all marching against the Iraq War. And so it was a really heavy time. And I think we often forget about just how weird of a moment it was. I remember there was this, one of the few moments of levity I had during that time was, I think Jon Stewart was doing some really good coverage at the time and was, now I think people take for granted because I think we live in a world where there's a lot more content that sort of speaks to our sort of politics or our viewpoints. But at the time there was like, you had to really like go and find it. And especially wasn't on any type of mainstream television.
Yeah.
So I remember like 2-3 weeks after 9/11, Jon Stewart on The Daily Show was doing basically a bunch of shows on sort of our reaction. And the tagline was America Freaks Out. And I remember my dad and I just cracking up, being like, that was kind of like only like a white guy could really sort of say that. But I was really grateful that he did, because when, like it felt like a very sort of McCarthyistic time in that, like, if you tried to say something, you'd be like, there was a litmus test. And if you tried to talk about foreign policy, if you tried to talk about any of this stuff, people would be like, well, hold on a second. Like, do you really want to, like 3,000 innocent people died in 9/11. And it's like, I don't have to like, at the time you're just like, of course, like you're constantly having to be like, no, of course it's horrible, instead of them just sort of, giving you the benefit of the doubt that, of course, like we are going to all sort of grieve any innocent person that dies, regardless of how they die. It's a very sad thing. But we do need to.
Well, and the outcome of that was things like the Patriot Act and some really intense like changes in civil liberties in America, right? And and government officials coming into mosques, and so it like really put our community on the defense very quickly, right? And in ways that suddenly your neighbors are okay with you being spied on. Suddenly your neighbors don't trust you. Those feelings were so intense in that moment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so, I'm of that generation. And I think we're all of roughly of that generation that sort of like really kind of grew up in a very intense time like that. And so, yeah, it all sort of, culminated to sort of, I think, create, who I am and like, what I do, and sort of, here I am at 40, I think still kind of, all of those moments had sort of this like, very indelible impact on me.
Well, we should talk about who you are. So you are a co-founder, is that right, of Pillars Fund? And tell us about kind of what Pillars is and then how you got there in your career, why this is something you decided to do.
Yeah. So the Pillars Fund is an organization I started with some friends in 2010. And at the time, there was like sort of just like a very sort of simple goal, which was how do we raise money and give to sort of this newish field of like civic Muslim nonprofits, like organizations. Like I think one of the things that is important to sort of note in the history of sort of Muslims in America was that, you had organizations like CARE and MPAC who had started sort of, in the 90s. But largely there weren't that many. I think most of our dollars were really going towards, I think a lot of our dollars were going towards like masjids and Islamic schools. And I think that there was this sort of burgeoning field of like civic nonprofits that were kind of started by a lot of people like me who were sort of connected with their Muslim identity. The work they were doing was like largely Muslim led, but it wasn't necessarily just sort of serving Muslims. It was like working on issues like civil rights. It was working on things like healthcare, et cetera. And I became really enamored by this sort of just generation of leaders. They were a few years older than I was. And I was really inspired. There was a guy named Rami Nashashibi who is now a very close friend of mine, and started this organization called the Inner City Muslim Action Network. And they were like, they still are the stuff of legends, but to a 23-year-old me, I was just like, it was like some of the most groundbreaking work I'd ever seen, which was, it was everything that I thought Islam really was this sort of like this faith of action and helping and doing all of these things. And so for me, like, my career had always been in this space. I'd kind of fallen into philanthropy. I'd sort of been working in nonprofits. So I was always kind of like the little bit of that do-gooder in my 20s, always kind of like trying to figure out a way to build a career working at these big institutions. And Pillars really started as just an idea in 2010, which was, I'd sort of looked around and like, what's happening right now? It's like, we have some really interesting, like kind of like young Muslims who are in tech and medicine and et cetera, and they're coming into a little bit of money. And how do we then sort of like kind of strategically sort of align some of that, philanthropy and give and create sort of a way to support this new field of like civic Muslim organizations. And so that's really what the idea was in 2010. What it has turned into has been something I could have never imagined. I never ever in a million years imagined that we would be sort of a robust organization with 15 full-time employees working all over the country on issues like, surveillance to mental health to building programs that support Muslim artists and storytellers. So the goal of Pillars, at its onset is to amplify the voices and the narratives and the talents of Muslims in America. That's really just what the goal is. And we've been able to do that through a number of different ways, but there is still a lot. I mean, obviously there's a lot of work to do. So this is not sort of me patting myself on the back by any means, but I do think sometimes I'll sort of sit down and when I have a moment to myself, think I can't believe how far this thing has come. And it really speaks to just like what I think the need was, because I think that Pillars is not only doing that work, not only sort of supporting sort of this, burgeoning field of Muslim, civic leaders and artists, et cetera, but it's also sort of become not a singular voice by any means, because I don't think we need a singular voice. I think we have multiple voices, but it has become a voice for Muslims in America. And I think that has been really special to me, and a responsibility that I don't take lightly, and a responsibility that we take very, very seriously. So it's been a really, really sort of, we launched full time in 2016. From 2010, I started in 2010, and from 2010 to about 2016, it was just kind of a side project that me and a few friends were working on. And then 2016, we sort of were able to secure some funding to really transition it from being a volunteer organization to this, what you see today, which is this sort of robust, nonprofit representing Muslims in America.
That's outstanding. And the one part that I want to sort of double click on, you talked about post 9/11, America freaks out. Jon Stewart being, the only white guy who could do something, and have a conversation. Today we live in a world where we have Riz Ahmed, we have Hassan Minhaj, we have Rami, we have others. And because you and Ambreen both grew up in the U.S., I grew up in Pakistan and sort of came here. What does that mean? What does that kind of representation and amplification mean? And how does the Pillars Fund sort of, groom the next generation or inspire the next generation of Muslim creators and directors to sort of continue to do this work? Talk to us a little bit about that, Kashif, about what that means.
Well, I think the idea of representation, I mean, I think it's been talked about a lot, but I mean, I always sort of really personalize it and think about it from this perspective, is that I think I was a pretty creative kid. I think I was someone that was always kind of off the beaten path, and I got very lucky that I was able to sort of find a career and build something that has given me as much purpose as I've had. So this is by no means as complaining by that or complaining about that. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, there was just this noise that. Okay, sorry. So representation is really important because I've said this to Riz before, and I said when I was like 15 or 16 and I had seen someone sort of that kind of looked like me, that sort of talked like me, that sort of whatever, on film and television, I think my path would be very different. Like, I'm not saying that that's what I really wanted to do, but I do think that, like, one thing about me was that, I did, like, my imagination didn't unlock until I was much older. Like, and I do think that, like, I remember very distinctly having these feelings when I was like 15, 16, because my sister and I talk about how we're like TV junkies. Like, my parents all love it when I say this, but we were like raised by television, and we watched a ton of TV. I mean, we were like latchkey kids. Like, we were just like my parents were like, always gone, and we'd come home, we would just watch tons and tons of TV. And so pop culture was like really, really important to us. Like, my sister and I still like sort of talk through like pop culture references from like the 90s. And so it was a really big part of our life. And, I just don't think, I remember distinctly thinking, like, I'm just a brown kid from Ohio. Like, I can't do that. Like, and again, it's not to say that that's, necessarily, I think I'm doing exactly what I was put on this planet to do. And so I'm very grateful. But I do think that's the power of it, is to sort of, when you see it, you sort of, your imagination unlocks. And so for me, I think the work that we're doing at Pillars is really trying to do two things. Like, one, it's trying to just create the space for the people who want to do it to be able to do it. I want them to be able to tell the stories that they want to tell. Those stories don't have to be about Muslims. I want to support Muslims telling a diverse array of stories. I think that's what's so exciting, like horror, sci-fi, whatever it is. Like, I just think it's important to have like Muslim voices out into the world doing, telling these like really kind of unique and interesting stories. And then the second is, like, I think representation is important. I do want young people today to kind of see this, like, one thing that you named, like one big flaw that we have is that a lot of the Muslim representation on screen has been men. Like, there hasn't been a lot of like women who have received, even though there's like immensely talented women, Muslim women out there doing incredible work in terms of their visibility and profile, like the Hassans and the Ramis and the Rizes have sort of really like dominated that. So I think that there's so much more work to be done there. Like, there's so much more work to be done to ensure that, like, I think for a really long time we were sort of okay with 1 or 2 or 3 representations. And I think, Muslims are 1% of America. We are a massive global audience and a global community. And so I think that for me, if the work, I've always said that, after I'm long gone, my metric of success for Pillars will be, is there just a more robust ecosystem of Muslim leaders and Muslim artists and, all of it. Like, that to me is going to be the real mark of success for our work. And, it's a cycle, like the goal right now is for a 14-year-old kid to be watching TV and seeing a Rami or seeing a Sana on, Sana Amana from Miss Marvel or whatever it is, and being like, oh, I want to do that, or I can do that. And then it's like this, and then they sort of go and sort of do the things, and then there's a 13-year-old kid that sees them, and so I think that to me is what excites me, and I think that so much of what Pillars, I always say that like so much of what the work that Pillars is doing is really stuff that I just wish was around when I was a kid. Like I'm really just sort of building and trying to work on building something that I wish was around when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. And, to the, something that spoke to both my mom, like who was sort of a bit more traditional in the ways that she saw the world, and my dad, who was not. Like that was really, because to me, that's the beauty of of Muslims in general, but particularly Muslims in America. I think that's like the beauty of like these communities, is that like we always talk about how we're not a monolith, and yet like we sort of sometimes act like a monolith. I'm like, no, we like, that's the thing that I think really excites me about Pillars, is that we want to honor and support the history of Black Muslims who've been in this country, who, I've always said that like Islam in America literally doesn't exist in the way that it does today without Black folks. Like they sort of ushered and sort of brought Islam to America, through enslaved Africans, that came here to all the way up to the civil rights movement, to Worth D. Muhammad, to, Elijah Muhammad. So like, all, it's the way that Islam is understood in America today, we have an enormous debt of gratitude that we owe Black communities for it. And so that's one part of it. But then you have this immigrant population of Arabs and South Asians, and, that also have this rich history of building and creating sort of culture in America. And so really the goal of Pillars is to be able to honor that and support it in ways that hopefully will create more of it and inspire more representation, because we still have a very, very long ways to go.
Yeah, I think in that post 9/11 moment, you talk about being a monolith. A lot of people went into law and policy and government jobs, and our community kind of reacted in a pretty strong way by kind of gravitating towards these careers. But I don't think that there was much conversation around, hey, we need artists, we need celebrities, we need actors, we need, kind of the kind of soft power that comes with being part of the culture. And I guess that's come out from the people that have gravitated into it, the handful of folks that we do have. But I wonder how you'd reflect on that, especially having been raised by somebody who was an artist. Like, what kind of power do you see come from that kind of representation? And do you think that our community is now seeing that? Do you think that people like Riz and Kumail and Hassan, like they help our community see that this matters?
I think that like the reaction, I think, and I think this, I want to keep it to what I know, which is sort of Pakistani communities. And I think that it's a really safe bet to say that a lot of Pakistani communities in this country, a lot, not all, like didn't have a lot of imagination when it came to sort of the ways that we sort of engage, and in the ways that we sort of like, engage with art and sort of see the world. And so I do think that it was, like I don't usually like, because I think that, Muslims are they were so diverse. And so I did, the Arab experience and the Black experience and sort of, all of these are different experiences. The Latino experience is very different. So I can really only speak to the Pakistani experience. And I would be a little bit critical of that, because I do think that we definitely sort of weren't encouraged to sort of pursue these things. And I do think that like we are in some ways, and to be clear, and this is a conversation I have had with many of these artists, that the world was not a welcoming place for Muslims or South Asians or Pakistanis or whatever, like in the early 2000s. Like I have a lot of respect for, like I know, like, there's, some people sort of haven't always loved the way that Kumail Nanjiani is sort of like engaged and sort of, but I have a lot of respect for him because, he's like, admitted to some of his mistakes, particularly around in the ways that he portrayed, Pakistani women in The Big Sick. And I appreciate his sort of ability to reflect on that and sort of, offer remorse. And, but also like, it was hard. And did he kind of give into some stereotypes that I think were maybe not the best? Sure. But I think it's important to offer grace, because the Hollywood was very different. And this is where I give a lot of I think Rami Youssef deserves a lot of credit, because I think that he sort of created, like one thing that I was always blown away by, and I've known Rami for a couple of years. And I remember when he sent me the pilot of his episode before it sort of gotten picked up, I remember I was having a conversation with him where I was like, there was an audacity to that show to be like, I was like, I can't believe that you just thought like you would write such a specific ass show about Muslims and like people would just care. I love that he did that. But that I think is a generational difference, because like I never thought my experience was that, like in the 90s and the early 2000s, I was like, who the hell would want to hear about like my life? And then like you have this next generation that's like, no, I think this is all pretty interesting actually, and people want to watch it. And I was like, and then you watch it and you're like, oh my God, like this is crazy that like, this has sort of found an audience. And it makes a lot of sense as to why it's found an audience. So I think it's really important. I think soft power, as you talked about, is incredibly important. And I do think that people are recognizing the power of it, because, like you go to any of these sort of, whatever, the fundraisers, this and that, they're always trying to get the Rizzes and the Kumails and stuff like that. So like, I do think that they recognize that there's a power to it, but I think the power, what I hope that we can sort of take this moment sort of as Pakistanis, because the thing that I think that we don't talk often enough about is that there is this like beautiful, rich history in Pakistan of art, and it's actually like a very beautiful and progressive country in the ways that we've thought about gender and sexuality and art and all of these things. It's like I think Pakistan has been flattened to sort of be sort of, and I struggle with this, because I think that while I have empathy for our parents' generation, and I don't begrudge them, because I think they were doing their best, I do think some of the ways in which they sort of engaged was like harmful. And there's a reckoning that we're sort of having to do right now in, even when it comes to just sort of topics around religion, you study Jinnah and you're like, this guy was fascinating and not religious even a little bit. And so like, and you start to like understand the complexities through which Islam was understood in Pakistan. And it's really interesting. And I think that I hope that we take this moment and we can sort of lean into our culture and our identity and our history, because I think it's there. And I do think it's changing. I mean, I think a lot of young people are a lot more comfortable they see a path forward. And if you do, like one of my favorite stories about my youth was, I'll give you the abridged version, but my first year, I've always struggled with like depression and had, their mental health is always like really run in my family, like pretty in an intense way. So I remember my first year of college, I actually dropped out. I went back, but I just was like a mess when I was 18, 19. I was just kind of like, what the hell am I doing? I was so, and now I look back and I'm like, oh, I was like very, very depressed. Like it was like, I couldn't get out of bed for days at a time. And I remember like I had all these like things, and that's when I actually got close to my dad. I started talking to my dad. He was really, really angry at me when I had sort of dropped out of college, and we sort of started to have these conversations. And I remember I was like, and you're kind of being stupid when you're a kid, and you're like, I was like, I want to like move to New York. And we were living in Cincinnati at the time. And he was like, why? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I just feel like that's where like life is. And he's like, okay, well, like you can go to college if that's what you want to do. I was like, no, I'm just gonna like go there. And he's like, no, like you're not just gonna like go there. Like that's ridiculous. Like, and I was like, but Baba, like I need like look at who you are. Like you are who you are today because of those struggles that you had, and I need to like have those struggles and that experience that you experienced. And he looks at me and he's like, fucking idiot, dude. Like I didn't do that so you had to do it too. Like I did it so you didn't have to do it. Like, and that was like a really big aha moment for me. I was like, oh, I guess that does make sense. Like, but like he was like, it would be a failure. Like if I came and you did all this and you had to do the same exact thing. And he's like, and if you decide to go and have kids and have a family and all these things, And I hope that your kids like will have to struggle less than you did. Like that's the goal. You don't always sort of succeed at that. I'd like to think that I did here. And so that's a little bit of how I think about young people sort of entering into the arts, to the space, is that I think we owe a debt of gratitude to a lot of the people that came before us who sort of created space and made it easier for us, and made it easier for young people, not us, but made it easier for young people to sort of pursue this. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I do reflect a lot on some of the harm that was done in that post 9/11, not just post 9/11, in that 90s sort of everyone has to be a doctor, everyone has to sort of do this. And while I think that there's some good that came with that, I mean, it's kind of nice to just be able to always find a Pakistani doctor, especially when you get older. You're just like, oh, hey, this is actually like, I know I kind of talk shit about this when I was in my 20s, but this is actually kind of nice that I can like go find, and and having like Muslim lawyers, all these things. I think, but Pakistani lawyers, I think it's important. But
yeah, it's so true. Not discount that at all.
yeah.
I want to get to one. We've talked a lot about the heavy stuff. I want to take it to a slightly lighter note for a few minutes. But Kashif, what's it like interacting with some of these Muslim celebrities at a human level? And also, we've kind of shaken off the model minority myth as a community, but then have the Muslim celebrities got to wear the Muslim model celebrity sort of garb because now they feel the pressure of representation and all of that. Like, talk to me about what it's really like sort of being in these rooms with these folks who are sort of, representing us, but also sort of making the path for more Muslims to emerge in that way.
I mean, first of all, I have a deep empathy for a lot of them, because I don't think in the last 10 years you could be a Muslim with any type of sort of celebrity and not be sort of activated politically. And while I think that is something that sort of comes naturally to sort of the Rizes and the Hassans, I do sometimes have empathy, because it's like my colleague Arij at Pillars always talks about sort of like the desire or the allowance to sort of be frivolous, that we are just like never really like afforded that opportunity. Like, I was thinking about how one of my favorite comedians these days is a guy named Nate Bargatze, and he is, if you all haven't seen him, he's just one of the funniest people I've ever sort of seen. And he's just this like Southern guy from Tennessee who just talks about like nothing heavy. It's just silly comedy. Or someone like Conan O'Brien, who I'm like very, very obsessed with, And I think a lot about how like we just haven't been afforded the opportunity to sort of just be silly, or be like, everything feels like really, really heavy. And I do feel for them, because, there is an enormous burden. And again, I think that we are privileged and lucky to have people who are willing to sort of take that battle on. But that being said, like I sometimes just, I think of someone like Mo Amer, and who I love, and I think is so good, and I think his show on Netflix was actually just wonderful. I really, really loved that show a lot. And but like, he's been able to get at some of that, and just the sort of the silliness, and Rami's been able to get to that, some of that silliness. But I mean, I think that like, I think they all just take that responsibility very, very seriously, and I'm very sort of grateful that they do. But I also have empathy that I'm just like, man, I hope we can get to the point where just because you're Muslim, like, doesn't mean that you have to have an opinion on every single thing. Like, I do sometimes just miss the silliness, and hope that we can sort of offer ourselves a little bit of that. And so that's what I think about a lot, is the burden that sort of exists on many of them.
Yeah. Reed and I kind of struggle at a very micro level with this podcast, even with the same thing, which is how do we sort of, be real and talk about identity and the burden of everything sort of that takes place. And also, how do we keep it lighthearted, and how do we, I like the way that you said, the license to be frivolous or silly. And I think that that's just so powerful. And, I'm obsessed with Conan O'Brien. I love him. And I'm like, there could not be a more white guy, like, than Conan. And I'm like, how, what is the brown version of that? And even seeing everything playing out with Hassan Minhaj right now, and I'm like, it would have been different had he not been brown. I mean, it's complicated, but like you're just like, what the hell?
100%, because like I think that the notion of sort of it's hard to the one brown Muslim comedian who has a pretty big platform. He's the one person that you're sort of now like nitpicking his sort of comedy act. It's weird. It's super, super weird. And this is sort of what I'm talking about, is that, I don't think it's conspiratorial to be like, I think there's like really active forces that don't want people like us to succeed, particularly in that industry, because of the visibility that comes with it. And with, someone like Hassan, who has sort of raised a lot of issues that I think make people feel uncomfortable. And again, it's something that like, it's very much in the vein of Jon Stewart, and you can just sort of look at, I mean, I really admire Jon Stewart, but I also think about like, if you want to understand white privilege in this country, I think you just have to look at someone like Jon Stewart and the things that he was able to say in post 9/11. I'm so grateful for him that he was able to say it, but particularly in that era, like, he had a license to say things that, like, I mean, no one with a darker skin tone could even dream about saying some of those things without sort of being accused of some of those vile stuff. And I don't think it's that dramatically different today. I mean, I think that we have more voices out in the world, but I think Hassan's case really does sort of show us that, there is sometimes you just feel like, oh, you can be successful, but not that successful. Like, slow down. Like, like there does feel to be this sort of thing of like, someone was, getting as popular as he was. I do think there was like a little bit of like, well, let's bring him down a notch a little bit, because, let's really show him, So I think that's really frustrating to see, for sure. And I admire many of them for having the really thick skin to be able to navigate an industry that I think can be really gross a lot of the times, to be completely honest.
Yeah, it's so true. And I was just thinking about Aziz too as you were talking, and whatever people think of the incident with Aziz, I feel like it transformed him so deeply, right? Like his comedy changed so much. I feel like his disposition, his public persona kind of disappeared a little bit. And
He's like living in London now, sort of just like off the grid. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
And culturally, I feel like that's a loss, right? Because I want these voices. I want more of them. I want, I think.
Well, because it's like, we talked about representation, and to me, that was the thing. I remember I was 18. I was watching like Best Week Ever on VH1, and I saw a guy named Aziz Ansari, and I was like, that's South Asian. That's a Pakistani Muslim name if I've ever seen it. And so I had no idea who he was, but I was just so excited to see a brown guy on TV with the name Aziz Ansari. It was crazy. Like, I don't think that people will actually, like, I think our generation sort of, I always tell the story, for me, with the music thing, I always tell the story about how the first time I saw anyone sort of on TV that was like brown and in sort of like a mainstream music punk sort of scene was Sum 41. The band Sum 41 had a brown guitarist. I believe he's Guyanese, but I might be wrong about that. I can't exactly remember, but he was brown. And I will never forget exactly where I was when I saw this band and I saw this brown guitar player, and I was like, oh my God, like, I can't believe, like, I remember literally thinking like, oh, we can do that. Like, it was profoundly powerful. And if anybody knows that guy, I would love to meet him, because like, it's so funny, because it's like, I like have gotten to meet the people that I think people get excited about, but it's like, I am like more like, it's like these weird niche, like I would be more excited to meet that guy than anyone, like any other celebrity that I've met. I'd be like, oh my God, I got to meet this guy. And so, but yeah, like, I mean, I think that's, it's really important.
Yeah. And I think the point that you're making about representation is so important, because you hear that a lot, right? Like even during Black Lives Matters and all these conversations about kind of diversifying, companies, leadership, government, everything, right? I think people say, okay, it matters. You need to be able to see people that look like you in positions of power. And that's how you kind of create greater potential for others. But it sounds a little tropey, a little bit soft to me sometimes. And I guess like it's so true though. Like when you turn on the TV, and I'm so sensitive to this now because, I see my kids watching shows, and there are still a lot of like kids shows that are all white casts that don't have any diversity in them. And I am so sensitive to it now because I'm like, really, in 2023 you can get away with that? Like, I know I grew up with that where every single person on TV was basically white, but at this point, like, how can these shows not have greater diversity in them? Or, like, I just think, yeah, the representation matters. Like my kids, they were really into Miss Marvel, and they got into like the Coke Studio songs and really got interested in Urdu music through it, which was so cool. And then I took them to see Rocky or Rani, the new Karan Johar movie, and they loved it. And so like I try to kind of constantly give them our culture as much as I can, show them that representation, because I think it can inspire them to be like, okay, yeah, like any of these things are possible for me. People like me do all sorts of things,
Oh yeah, and shout out to Sana and G. Willow Wilson for Miss Marvel. I actually think that Miss Marvel was one of the most important pieces of art to come out in the last like 20 years. I think that in terms of its importance, I've said this to Sana many times. I'm so grateful for them that they, like the amount of little girls I've seen dressed up as Miss Marvel see themselves on screen, like it's emotional. Like you really sort of get emotional because I don't even think they fully understand what I think the profound impact of something like that is going to be over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so
that's
yeah.
And
I'm forever grateful to both Willow and Sana and the whole cast and sort of, the whole thing, like everyone involved with it was just, it's a really special piece of.
Yeah, and the whole partition narrative, like I was like, I never thought Marvel would be the one to kind of document partition and carry it for a generation. But that, I was really obsessed with the partition when I was in college, and that was a real kind of concern for academics. Is like the partition and the stories and the history were gonna get lost when this generation moved on, because there just isn't, as much documentation about that as there were other events that happened at that time. And for my kids to be like, wait, so what happened? So how are Indian fog? Like it just sparked so much curiosity and interest in them about this moment and created this opportunity to talk about it. And I was just so grateful for that and so glad that that art just exists, right? So generations to come can also see it and then have that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's not enough words I can sort of use to sort of talk about the importance of that show and sort of that piece of art. Like, yeah, I'm grateful. I'm forever grateful for it.
Yeah.
So we didn't intend to go as deep into representation as we ended up going, but I feel like this is almost a perfect pitch or place now to understand what Pillars Fund does and how people in the audience that are sort of watching this can support the Pillars Fund. So maybe, Kashif, if you can talk a little bit, we talked about the issue. Now you're actually not just somebody who talks about the issue, but who is somebody who's actively doing something to solve it. So say there are people who want to support the Pillars Fund who are watching this right now. How do you help and how do they help you? So essentially, how do they help you do the work that you're doing to be able to help them and their kids sort of see more representation and see more Muslim voices here?
Well, I mean, I think that like first, I mean, I think that it's important for us to sort of bolster up the profile of an organization like the Pillars Fund. So like, I mean, like just check us out on social media, like, follow us and sort of see the work that we're doing. We're always trying to like highlight like really interesting things happening. One of the things that I've always tried to be with Pillars is sort of be a little bit of the eyes and ears of Muslim communities. Like, what are the really cool things happening around the country? Like, who are the cool people doing really interesting stuff? And so I think, something as tiny as sort of this, like, checking us out on social media and following us, I think goes a long way. And so I think that's important. And in terms of engagement, I mean, we do a bunch of different things, like we support, everything from sort of becoming a donor to Pillars, which, you're welcome to do and sort of read about it on pillarsfund.org. to sort of really checking out who our grantees are. I mean, we fund a lot of really awesome organizations around the country, sort of really kind of cool local grassroots organizations doing fascinating work. So go check out our grantees and see the work they're doing, and support them. Like go like find out the really cool things that they're doing. To the artist fellowship that we're doing, check out the content, like check out the incredible stuff that they're putting out. Like one of our fellows, Nadra, was a writer on Miss Davis on Peacock. Go check out, support these Muslim writers and these Muslim talents. Like I think it's so important to sort of check out what we're doing, and for all of us to kind of be, and I know it's cliche because I don't think it's unique to Muslims, and I don't think that Muslims are sort of like, tearing each other down or anything like that. I do think we're a relatively like supportive community, but I think it's important for us to be even more supportive and sort of be even more kind of like really like lift up. Like for a long time, we've been waiting for representation, or not just representation on film and television, but representation in like, in the civic arena. Like, look at like, we have Muslim congresswomen, while we're a 501c3 organization, so we don't fund specific candidates, like in my personal capacity, I'm like literally being like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like we have Rashida, we have Ilhan, we had Keith Ellison. Like, I mean, we have allies like, AOC, and like, it's really incredible to sort of see the diversity. And so my, what I would say is it's, in order to support Pillars Fund, support the work that Muslims are doing, and that could be through Pillars, or that could just be independent of Pillars. But really, we just want to build a world in which Muslims can thrive, and Muslims are thriving, and their stories are being told, and, our voices aren't being silenced. That's, to me, that's the most important way to be able to support the work that we're doing.
That's outstanding. And I want to ask you the same question from the opposite angle as well. So if I'm a young Muslim director, a young Muslim writer, a young Muslim change maker who needs support, what are the kind of people that you are looking to support, that you're looking to elevate, like, and how do they engage with you on that front as well?
Yeah, and to me, I would say, check out our website. I think we've really laid it out as clearly as possible in terms of, we just closed the application for our second round of fellows. We had a really successful first round of the Pillars Artist Fellowship, which we co-founded with Riz and his team at Left Handed, which was awesome. We had like such a blast doing that. We worked with Netflix and Amazon, and we had incredible people like Mahershala Ali and Hassan and Sana, and like, just, the who's who of sort of Muslim Hollywood be a part of that, which was a lot of fun. We just closed the applications for the second round. So I would say that for those that are aspiring, go check that out and see if, like we tried to lay out pretty clearly in terms of like what we're looking for, and, what types of people. And then in terms of on the civic side, similarly, like, what I would really encourage everybody to do is to sort of just do something. And I think what happens is that, like I know people, I'm one of the crazier ones that sort of have dedicated my life to this, but you don't have to dedicate your life to this. Like I think that, something small, like doing something, I think is just so important. And that could be something like making a donation or volunteering or sort of being, whatever it might be. I just want young people to sort of really recognize that there is a path out there to be able to pursue this. It's a hard path, regardless of having more resources like Pillars out in the world. It's a really tough path. I mean, last year we had over 600 people apply for 10 spots in the Pillars Artist Fellowship. I mean, that's a lot. Like, and this year, I think we're about we had a lot. I don't have the final number in terms of how many people applied, but it's a lot. It's in the hundreds. And so for 10 for 10 spots. And so I do think that sometimes, it can feel overwhelming, but I think it's important to sort of, just do something, and whatever that sort of looks like. And if you want to do it through Pillars, and you want to like understand how we work, check us out, like website, social media, etc. Like, we do a lot, but you're going to learn more from that than anything I tell you on this podcast at the moment, because, we do a lot of different things.
One of the things I think Pillars offers the Muslim community is that it seems like there's no judgment about what it means to be Muslim. to participate in kind of the Pillars community. And I think you'll know what I mean, just because some of the early models of organizations that we had were so kind of entrenched in the faith. And so we're pretty much like, I think, kind of defining for people like what it meant to be Muslim or what it meant to be Muslim enough to participate. And I think having grown up kind of more culturally Muslim, found a lot of those spaces not very comfortable. And so I'm really impressed by how Pillars feels like way more inclusive than any other Muslim organization I've seen. And I want to kind of get your reflection on that. Like, was that intentional? And is that true? Do you try to stand apart a little bit in terms of both being an organization tied to a religion, but also not necessarily defining what that faith should mean for people who participate?
It's 100% intentional. I mean, that was, before I had a strategy, before I even sort of knew what Pillars was going to be, I had sort of made up my mind that this organization was going to be an inclusive space for Muslims in however they identify. And it's precisely because I have respect for the faith that I operate that way. Like, it is not my job to tell somebody how to be Muslim or how not to be Muslim. That is frankly, I don't think any of our jobs is to sort of, kind of create those parameters and boundaries. And so for me, it's like I said, it's exactly because I have respect for the faith to be like, who am I, to sort of say that, this is a very complex, nuanced faith, and everyone engages with it in a very specific way. And I don't think there's any two people in the world who engage with that faith the exact same way. And so I think that's what makes sort of faith special and unique. And I think that's what makes Muslims in America really, like, to me, that's like our strength, is that we are like, it's not just diversity around race and gender and sexuality, but it's also diversity in just like how we interpret and how we understand and how we follow our sort of faith. And so I'm really glad that, that you see that, and that's something that sort of is an observation that you've made, because that is probably one of the most important things to me, is that I have always wanted this space to be a space free of judgment, free of sort of, people will often ask me like, well, you say you support Muslim-led organizations, how do you define Muslim? I'm like, I define Muslim by, if you say you're Muslim, you're Muslim. Like, that's my definition. Like, I don't actually have a definition beyond that. And so, and I get, for some people it's complicated and it's complex and this and that. And that's great. Like, go and sort of engage with that and sort of do it. But that sort of theological kind of debate that you want to have, Pillars just not the place for it. And I think that's one thing that, is one piece of advice I give everybody to, anyone who sort of talks to me, is that just, you can't be everything to everyone. And I've made it very explicitly clear that, like, if you are, sort of wanting to come and be a part of a organization that isn't like entrenched in like theological debates about what it means to be a Muslim, like, the Pillars ain't it. Like, you're going to be very disappointed in that. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying that, like, you shouldn't do that or you shouldn't engage. Like, you're welcome to engage. Like I said, we're very nuanced and diverse. And so there's really great organizations out there that are sort of dedicated to Islamic scholarship and these conversations. And you should absolutely go and sort of be a part of those if that's something that you want to sort of really engage with. But, in terms of what we're trying to build at Pillars, like, we hold the faith in very high regard, and we hold, we're very proud of our Muslim identity. And it's because we are so proud of that Muslim identity. It is because we're so proud to be Muslim, and we revere sort of the faith, is exactly why I don't want to act in a way that I think is harmful to Muslims in America. So yeah, I mean, that's always been really important to me. And I, and as someone that, I always said that, and I've said this a few times, is that, going back to the beginning of this conversation, we talked about my mom and dad, and sort of, we talked about how my mom was sort of a more traditional, sort of prayed 5 times a day. I mean, I don't think my dad's ever been too much in his life. Like, and, but the goal for Pillars was always to be able to speak to both my mom and my dad. And that was always the goal. Like, in my head, like, can this be an organization? I'm not saying you're going to agree with every single thing that we do, but do you feel respected and do you feel seen in some way? And I'd like to think that we have sort of succeeded in that, because I do want sort of people of different persuasions to be able to sort of engage with this organization.
And gosh, if I feel like I have to say this, so you and I met last year at, or I guess earlier this year at South by Southwest, and we sat down across the table from me. We were having lunch, and you had the sweater or something on, and then you took it off, and you had a t-shirt, and you're tatted up. You have tattoos, and I know you don't think it's a big deal, but I was like, oh my God, like, have I ever met a Muslim guy with tattoos? I don't think I have. And so speaking of,
I think you have. You just
okay, maybe they're all hidden. I don't know.
Representation.
Let's say you have more tattoos, and it's not just like one tattoo that you hide, and it's like your thing. So speaking of kind of like diversity in the Muslim community, I do want to hear about that a little bit. Just sort of, was that kind of like a part of that rebellious thing that you're talking about in you, or was it ever an issue that you wanted to have tattoos? Like in my head, I feel like like my parents would be like, oh, it's haram to get a tattoo. Like, I don't know if that's the general thinking about them or not. Did you come up against that at all?
I mean, it's really funny because it's like I've always sort of just operated from this perspective of like, well, I like them, so I'm gonna do it. Like I don't know, like I didn't really like, there wasn't like that much thought put into it. I mean, I always just grew up around people that had tattoos, and I love art, and I love sort of, and so for me, like it was just something that I just like them. Like it's really that simple. I did, it's funny because I will say that going back to what I was saying about my mom, like, I adore that woman and miss her a lot. And so one of the things that I remember I said to her, I think I'd got my first one when I was like 30 or something. And I remember I went up to her and I was like, I actually already done it. And I was like, Mom, I'm gonna get a tattoo. And she's like, shut up, no, you're not. I was like, yeah, I think I'm gonna do it. And she was just like, I don't think this is funny at all. And I was like, I know, but like, I mean, it's gonna happen. And then I remember, this is really sweet. I will say this. I tell the story because it was very sweet. And I said to her, I've been a pretty good kid, right? Like, and I was very close to her, and I never really gave her a ton of grief. Even some of my rebellion, like, yes, I had rebellion, but like, I never gave her a ton of grief. And she was like, yeah. And I was like, so just like, I'm still going to be the same person. And I was like, and I made a joke, and I was like, you still love me, right? And she was like, of course. And I was like, all right, cool. I'm just going to keep doing it then. And she said something really, I think you two will appreciate, that made me laugh so hard, because this was about a year before she died. And she said, okay. Just don't show my family. I was just like, whatever. I'm like, sure. I'm like, I'm not like married to sort of, but I tell that story because it made me laugh, because it made me laugh because like there is still that, we all sort of, it's the trope that Hassan used in his first special about the look yakking thing. But it was a really funny thing. But again, I don't think it wasn't some agonizing thing. I did probably grow up with the same, like, you shouldn't do it. But I mean, things that I shouldn't do like that, there was just no parameter. I just never existed in a world where it's like, you shouldn't do it. I was like, okay, well, that doesn't mean I may not still do it, but I'm not going to not do it because I shouldn't. That's like a ridiculous way to live. And so, I feel like it was just more that. But I will say and to sort of, to sort of bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, I just told you the reaction that I had, that my mom had. Let me tell you the reaction that my dad had. It's actually quite funny. I was testing the idea with him, and I had sort of read this article that said tattoos are becoming kind of more popular in Pakistan. And my dad is like, my dad is teaching at National College of Arts now. He retired and he moved back to Pakistan. He's back there, so he's all of these like young musicians and artists and all these things. So I remember I said to him, I said, Baba, I've read that tattoos are becoming pretty popular in Pakistan. And he was like, oh, I don't know, like maybe. And I was like, what do you think? Like, do you think that's like, what do you think about tattoos? And I swear he was like, oh, well, I'm too old to get tattoos. And I was like, I'm not talking about you, dude. And then I was just like, all right, well, like, I mean, I don't. I'll just say that when you get older, like the things that you think really matter. I mean, listen, I'm sure that there's plenty of people with opinions on what you can and can't do, et cetera, and that's fine. I mean, that's totally cool. Like, there's plenty of people that like really want them and wouldn't do it, and that's totally cool. Like, you shouldn't do anything that you're not comfortable with. But I don't know. Like, it's legitimately, like, I'm so immune. Like, I don't even think about it because it's not something that I've really like. I just sort of, I kind of always just goes around people and like, it was always something that I was like, yeah, this is probably going to happen at some point. And yeah, there we are.
I love that. I love that. I feel like you're giving me permission to get a tattoo. You're like, just
I am not giving anyone permission to do anything, just so that we're clear. Like, I am giving no one permission. People should do what they think is best. I do not want any angry parents coming to me being like, I'm like, you guys do what you want to do.
Maybe an angry husband and 3 kids, but yeah.
Like, I certainly, I think everyone sort of has their sort of the thresholds of what they're comfortable with, what they're not. I've never viewed them as really anything that crazy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've got one more question from my side to round us out, but Amreen, maybe is there anything else from your side that you might need to pop out? But
no, I have to drop. This was such a lovely conversation, Kashif, and
yeah, you too, Amreen. Thanks so much for having it. It was so fun that we got to meet and then do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to following your work. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of exciting things that Pillars continues to do. So,
thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Awesome. So, Kashif, maybe the one last sort of question to bring us home, which is, where do we go forward as a community now? And one of the interesting things that you talked about was, how you wanted to create Pillars as a judgment-free sort of Muslim space. Also, to be able to create something like that, you need Muslim patrons and funders who support that. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that you exist also gives me hope that there is a community that exists around you that says, hey, Muslims have come far enough to sort of operate in that judgment-free zone to say, hey, we're going to support this work, we're going to make this happen. So talk to me a little bit about how you sort of place how far we've come as a community and how far and where we need to go next to continue to advance some of these aspirations that we have that you've talked about.
I actually think that one of the sort of the bigger frustrations or sort of maybe misconceptions that I have, or the misconceptions that people have about Muslims, and I'll speak to sort of Muslims in America specifically, is that they don't see nuance, right? I mean, I can tell you that we are supported by plenty of people who may not agree with every single thing that we do, but they recognize that there is a real value and they understand that it's coming from a place of real love for the communities that we're serving, and they understand what our intentions are. And I think that there's a lot of people who can sort of parse out that sort of nuance, and they can be like, okay, cool. Like, Pillars might be a little bit more X than I would be, or maybe a little less X than I would be, whatever it might be. But I think Muslims have the ability to sort of see nuance. Now, we're living in an increasingly polarized world in which we are seeing sort of some of these sort of, some of the vitriol against sort of like, a lot of marginalized communities within Muslims sort of be targeted. And I think that's really unfortunate and really sad and something that really bums me out. But to me, like, I don't think we have the luxury to sort of operate from a place of despair. I just don't think we have that luxury because, one, I think that there's a lot more allies. And when I say allies, I mean within our own communities than there are detractors. Like, I think that it's really easy for us to kind of get down and just like, we all do this. It's like, if you're Pakistani, if you're Muslim, if you're Black, if you're Latino, sometimes you can just be like, God, our people are just the worst. Like, that's a thing that like, everyone sort of says to some extent. And yeah, sometimes we can be the worst. Like, sometimes it can just totally suck. But I think that I choose to kind of think about us, we are awesome way more than times than we suck. And are there going to be people within our
own communities that we feel sad in the ways in which the ways that, you know, opinions they hold and how they're operating in the world. Of course, like that is just, but at a certain point, I think that we have to recognize that there is a lot more people who sort of, see the world in the ways that I think that most of us see. And that doesn't mean that we will agree everything. We will all agree on sort of theological interpretations of the religion or whatever. Like, but that's like such a ridiculous barometer to use. Like, like no two people are going to fully agree. I mean, isn't that like one of the really cool things about the faith is that we can sort of interpret it in ways that, like bring us like personal, like joy and satisfaction. And so, I think for me, like, I'm not, and it's funny because it's like, I get asked this and I always sort of like, I'm just like, always offer this like very like optimistic note. And it's funny for those that know me on a personal level, like I'm not like Mr. Optimism. I'm not someone that walks around being like, oh, the glass is just like half full. Like I'm not like the most optimistic person, but my optimism is coming from being on the ground and being in these communities for like almost my entire adult life. And so my optimism is not rooted in sort of this, like, it's not Pollyannish. It's because I have been in communities and I've had conversations with a lot of people who I think understand the value of the work in the world that we're trying to create. So I don't know. That's if I didn't have that, I don't. Why would I even be? Why would I be dedicating my life to this? It seems like it'd be futile. But no, that's I genuinely do believe that.
Yeah, and that's such a beautiful note to sort of wrap this up on. I want to say I started by saying I want to grow up to be Kashif, and I still feel that even more now at the end of this conversation. But what's interesting and unexpected is how we both enjoy the same things as well. So Conan O'Brien was something I was obsessed with. TV was something that I sort of grew up consuming, shaped so much of my life. We also intersected in Cincinnati.
Yeah.
I lived there for a couple of years. Astoria, my wife was there. I was there for a couple of years. But I think the difference between me and you is that you did it. And you talked about how not everybody needs to dedicate their life to doing this. Some people can just volunteer. Some people can just do this. But there's something to be said about someone who dedicates their whole life to this. And I think that that's what's so inspiring and heartwarming. And we talked about how the Rizes of the world and the Hassans of the world and the Ramis of the world, will inspire kids to go, into pop culture and influence that. But there's also something to be said about the Kashifs of the world who are sort of creating space and doing things for Muslims in the nonprofit space and the change-making space that even though I work in a nonprofit, I never thought I could work in a Muslim nonprofit. I never thought I could make a difference within this space. And I think the trail that you're blazing in this space is so inspiring. And the fact that you did it when nothing existed, you talked about how, you felt it was so cool and weird that Rami actually wrote a show on his authentic experience and actually thought that somebody would pick it up. I think you did the same thing with the Pillars Fund, where you were crazy enough to say, hey, this is something that I want to do and I'm going to do it. And I think that that's the magic and the power of your story. And I think that it's so beautiful for us as a community to have someone like you. So thank you.
That's amongst the nicest things I've ever. That's a very, very sweet. And thank you so much, Bilal, for saying that. And I think we're all sort of doing our part. I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful that. Wow, that was really nice. That was really nice. Thank you for saying that. I think this work can feel. I think you can have sort of. I think we all sort of can sometimes have these weeks or these moments where you're just like, "What the hell am I doing?" And I'm not gonna lie, I've sort of had a little bit of that lately, and so that was that felt. I was just those. I'm really thank you for saying that. That was very sweet, and that was really nice, and I feel the same. Listen, I feel that we're all doing our part in this, and I'm grateful to have been able to. Been afforded the opportunity to do this and be interacting with so many incredible people like you. So thank you for having me, and thank you for this conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely. We had a blast chatting with you as well. And we'll have you back for season 3 as well. We want to continue to see how your story evolves. I'm gonna turn off the record button, but if you could stay back for a minute, that would be great.